Ukraine, I believe, is running out of manpower. They've suffered a huge amount of casualties. Russia has as well. But Russia can absorb that more than Ukraine can, and Ukraine is feeling the pain now.
Ukraine and Russia seem to be coming closer to a deal or some kind of peace agreement, or at least that's what recent news suggests. How do you think the war will end in Ukraine?
Well, it's very, very difficult to say at this stage, even though there's been what appears to be some progress in trying to get the two sides together. But whatever the detail of it, I can't see Putin accepting anything less than, at the very least, the land he possesses now that he invaded in 2022 and managed to conquer, and probably more than that, as he told President Trump in Anchorage, that he wants not just the areas of the Donbass that he possesses now, but the rest of it as well, the whole thing. And of course, that is going to be very hard for Zelensky to agree. So it could be we see some kind of breakthrough one side or the other. I suspect it's probably not imminent, but it's, I suppose, a possibility.
In terms of the situation on the battlefield, Russia has been making steady but slow gains in recent weeks. Do you think that Ukraine can actually outlast this war? Do you think that Ukraine has the manpower and the resources to hold off the Russians for a long period?
Depends on a large number of factors. And the first one is the extent to which Ukraine is going to continue receiving Western support from Europe and also from the US. And it may be that they're able to hold on to something like the ground they've got now for a reasonably long period of time with that support. Without it, then that becomes obviously much more difficult. But they've got a pretty substantial defensive line, which is going to hold the Russians back probably for quite a long time. It really depends how much effort the Russians put into overcoming the defensive line. But the chances of holding them back permanently without Western support are obviously much less. And we might see perhaps President Trump deciding to apply pressure on Ukraine by withholding support, because I think it's probably going to change the scenario entirely if that US support does not continue to come. The other factor, of course, that Zelensky has to consider is the regular damage that's being done to his population centers by Russian attacks, and that's obviously quite severe and could get worse. And that obviously comes into the equation. And then, ultimately Zelensky must decide, I think, and his government must decide whether he's going to be able to hold on to the land in the long term, and if he does, what the cost of that is. I'm not just talking about the defense costs, the financial costs, but the cost to deaths in Ukraine, both on the battlefield and off.
There's obviously a huge amount of pressure on Zelensky to come to some kind of peace agreement. What about the pressure on Vladimir Putin? Can he sustain this war in the way that he has over the last few years?
Again, it's quite a difficult question to answer. I think one thing that has made a bit of difference to the extent that he can sustain the conflict is Western sanctions, but they haven't been in any way decisive and they haven't been sufficient. It may be that with much, much greater pressure from sanctions from the US, from the European countries and from other allies, it may be that his economy does begin to struggle. But at the same time, as we know, Europe is still buying Russian gas. It's still, as a result, pumping a lot of money into Russia's war economy. And if these harsher sanctions are applied, then they bite back as well at those countries that are applying them. They will have an economic effect on the West. So I'm not confident that either the West will impose much more severe sanctions, or indeed, if they do, that will totally turn the tables. It's a possibility. Without that, or even with that, I think Putin has developed his war economy to the extent, yes, of course, there are structural economic problems within Russia as a result of this war, but he looks like he can withstand those for the time being anyway. And he has turned his war economy into a pretty impressive machine, turning out vast quantities of munitions of all different sorts. So he can, I think, I think that the cards are pretty much in his hands. It really depends, I suppose, from his perspective and what he's prepared to concede, if anything, is this potential impact on the economy if greater sanctions are applied, and two, his desire to remain or to return to respectability within the international community. I'm not sure how strong that feeling is.
In hindsight, do you think that Ukraine's attempt at a counteroffensive last summer was a mistake?
Yeah, I think the reality was that obviously was not clearly understood by either Ukraine or its Western allies, particularly European allies, was that Ukraine had insufficient to really push back against Russia. They had insufficient forces, both in numerical terms, in the number of soldiers available to them, and also in hardware terms, the amount of military equipment, tanks, artillery, drones, rockets, aircraft that they needed in order to sustain, in order to impose severe damage on Russia. So I think it probably was an error. Certainly in hindsight, it was an error. Many people weren't particularly optimistic about it at the time. And I don't think, and because of the lack of, I don't think it was a kind of predetermined situation. I think perhaps had the West given Ukraine a lot more than it did, had Biden given more, had European countries given more support, then Ukraine could have been stronger. But that didn't happen. I don't believe that Biden or indeed the European leaders, no matter how much they might protest, really did want Ukraine to prevail. I think they were happier, in both cases, happier with something more of a stalemate, so as not to antagonize Russia to too great a degree.
To what extent has this war become an attritional conflict similar to the First World War?
Well, there's lots of similarities to the First World War and the Second World War, but at the same time, it's also become, one of the most important 21st century wars and one of the most deadly 21st century wars. And the attrition rates have been, traditionally attrition has been imposed predominantly by artillery in the First World War and the Second World War. That's still true today. There's still a lot of attrition inflicted on both sides by artillery, but drones have taken, I think, a much stronger role in this war, and probably now are responsible for inflicting more casualties than any other weapon that's being used by either side. And of course, though drones don't, in many cases, particularly the lighter drones, don't carry huge quantities of explosives, they are able to be directed with great accuracy, which obviously increases their lethality. But what we have got a war of attrition in many ways, and that attrition really, the decisive elements of that are probably manpower. And Ukraine, I believe, is running out of manpower. They've suffered a huge amount of casualties. Russia has as well, but Russia can absorb that more than Ukraine can, and Ukraine is feeling the pain now of very large numbers of soldiers being taken out of battle.
When you were fighting in Afghanistan, your enemy had a technological disadvantage, but this war is between two countries with parity in technology available. Obviously, resources, there is a disadvantage for Ukraine. What lessons can the West learn from the Ukraine war so far, with two sides, as I said, with very similar technological advancement?
Well, I think recent conflicts, and this is where Western European countries do make mistakes, and recent conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq are really not that comparable to what's going on now. There are obviously factors that are similar in some respects, but it's minimal. As you said, we're talking about a war between industrialized countries with their allies supporting them in both cases. And I think, if anything, the key lesson here for the West is not so much on the technology side. There are obviously major technology lessons to be learned. So I mentioned one of them, drones, for example, which do have to be absorbed. And there are others like cyber war and the sophistication of particularly airborne intelligence collection systems, etc. But I think the key lesson is that out of this conflict for the West is that hardware, hardcore weaponry, tanks, artillery, planes, rockets, all of these things, and manpower, infantry soldiers on the ground, remain every bit as relevant today as they ever did, just as relevant. And it's a mistake that Western armies have made, including the British Army, in recent defence reviews and reconsiderations of their strategic priorities of, I think, placing far too high an emphasis on technology, very important though it is, and far too little an emphasis on military hardware and manpower. And it was only, I think, a few years ago that David Cameron, for example, I think it was him who said, or it may have been Boris Johnson, I forget, one of the Conservative leaders said the days of big tank battles are long gone, which may be true. We're not looking at some kind of Kursk Second World War style tank battles or any of the other major tank battles that occurred, but we're not talking about sweeping movements across plains of large formations of tanks, but tanks nevertheless remain extremely important. And I think that lesson, the lesson of traditional military hardware, albeit updated and improved with technology, also can be drawn out of the conflict that's been going on for nearly 3 years now between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And again, that's an imbalanced conflict, not really akin either to Iraq or Afghanistan, but one side is very sophisticated, the other isn't. But the importance and the value of heavy military equipment and manpower has again proven its worth and its necessity there.
And what about morale? It seems that the Ukrainians have been draining morale for the last couple of years. If you look at opinion polls, their support for Zelensky has declined. Their kind of willingness to fight seems to be declining as well, as more and more Ukrainians die on the battlefield.
Yeah, and morale is probably the single most important factor in any conflict. I think Napoleon said the moral to the physical as 3 is to 1. And okay, you can have the best equipment, the most sophisticated technology, but you can't win unless your fighting soldiers and the civilian population behind them have high morale and have confidence that they're going to win and what they're doing is worth the fight. The same applies to a lesser extent in Russia, where the situation is obviously very different. We're not talking about a democracy there, we're talking about a dictatorship, and incentives to fight are different. But Ukraine essentially has been on the back foot since the early days of this war. Yes, they took some significant gains in the south and the north early on in the war, but since then they've really been fighting back against an advancing enemy, albeit not advancing very, very fast, but nevertheless advancing. And Ukraine, I think a key element of morale is the performance on the battlefield, the achievements on the battlefield that can be seen by the soldiers themselves and by the civilians behind them. And of course, I think, operations like the Ukrainian attack into Kursk last year, I think it was, that I think had a significant effect on morale. It was the first time that a large portion of Russian territory had been taken by any country since the Second World War. And that injected, I think, a lot of morale, a lot of good spirits into the Ukrainians. But it was a kind of short-lived episode which really didn't achieve. It may have had some minor achievement. I don't think achieved anything strategically. And so probably in the longer term had a negative effect on morale. But you're right to say that I think, a lot of Ukrainians no longer want to fight this war. There are some fairly high desertion rates, I believe, among the Ukrainian forces. And also I think opinion polls recently have shown that they want the war to end and end soon. Of course, anyone will want the war to end, but many people, I can't quote you statistics, but I think many large numbers of Ukrainians would be willing to, maybe reluctantly, but willing to give up territory of Ukraine in exchange for peace.
If you were in Zelensky's shoes right now, what would you do?
Well, it's an impossible thing for me to answer because I don't have all the facts that he has. And I think what I would need, obviously the desirable, what I would like to do, if I had all the resources to do it, is maximalist, is to shove the Russians back out of Ukraine, which obviously is something he wants to include all of Ukrainian territory, including the Crimea. Minimalist, I would like to at least hold on to the territory I've got now and perhaps consider negotiating to have a ceasefire or a peace agreement which gave the Russians the territory that they've conquered. But that, as I mentioned earlier, really the calculation there, which only Zelensky can really make, I think, is the extent to which he's optimistic about being able to hold the terrain that he holds now and the cost that that's going to bring to Ukraine in terms of bodies, not so much financial cost, but of dead Ukrainians. Plus, of course, the calculation of how strong public support is, because if he goes one way or the other, let's say he decides, and I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, but let's say he decides to capitulate to Putin's demands and gives them the whole of Donetsk in exchange for the little slivers of ground that he's offered in the north around Sumy and Kharkov, then that could lead to his downfall very easily. On the other hand, if he keeps fighting and keeps losing many, many Ukrainians, that could also lead to his downfall. So I'm not saying that his own political future is number one in his calculation, but obviously it's a factor. So I think I'm going to kind of duck out of the answer to that question and simply say those are really the two options he has, I think, at the moment, either to try and hold out, to retain the territory that Ukraine currently holds, or to capitulate more to what Putin wants.
And from the perspective of Western countries, including the United States, there's lots of controversy around Donald Trump actually meeting with Putin in Alaska. Even the suggestion of discussing ending the war with the Russian president, causes a lot of people to say, oh, this is appeasement, this is Trump cozying up to Russia, trying to give away Ukraine, essentially. But what should the West do? I mean, do you think that they should try and come to an agreement as Trump is doing? Or should we refuse to meet with Putin, keep sending weapons and, I don't know, hope for the best?
Well, I very much disagree with those people who complained about the summit in Anchorage. Obviously, the optics, as far as Putin were concerned, were not good from our perspective. It gave him, maybe, some people argue it gave him some credibility and the appearance of respectability. But, those two things are maybe not that important. What was important was that Trump really began, for the first time, I think, since this war started in 2022, began the process of somehow bringing about some form of peace. The Western Europeans who, and I don't think the same is necessarily true of the Eastern Europeans, I think they have a more realistic grasp on it. The Western European leaders who say, well, we must hold out, we must stand up at all costs. I think they're really, I think they're talking nonsense. They haven't enabled Ukraine to hold out at all costs for reasons that I mentioned before. Their lack of support, albeit they gave a lot of support, they didn't give enough, and they could have done more. But ultimately, Trump is really the facilitator here. And it's really got, these decisions are decisions that can only be taken by Putin and by Zelensky, not by Western European leaders. I think Western European leaders are marginal in this discussion. And don't really understand what they were doing in Washington at the summit with Zelensky. I think they were more than anything else trying to show their relevance, and I don't think they had any significant effect. But I don't. My reading of it is that Trump is not trying to decide. He's not trying to give away Ukraine. He's not trying to decide Ukraine must capitulate. I think he's trying to facilitate a process which will enable Zelensky to decide on the extent to which Ukraine is prepared to make concessions. Now, Trump may well, in his desire to bring about peace, he may well pressure Zelensky in one particular direction. But and the only real way I think that he can pressure Zelensky is by withholding US support, either directly or through the European countries, as is beginning to happen now, with Europeans paying for US arms, or is about to happen. And that's a possibility. I don't think it would be the right thing for President Trump to do if he decided to apply too much pressure on Zelensky. But I think he's made a significant achievement in getting to the stage where he's at now, and with the possibility that's been discussed at the moment of a meeting between Zelensky and Putin and Trump, which may or may not take us anywhere further. But at least it's, I think, some form of progress.
Trump hosted European leaders at the White House, including Keir Starmer, and he sort of did this round table where he asked all of them to make a contribution. Keir Starmer was criticised for sort of waffling on for 2 minutes, and he said, and this is a quote, "The war has had an impact on the United Kingdom. There's not a family or community that hasn't been affected." What do you make of Keir Starmer's intervention in that discussion?
As I said just now, I don't think that the presence of either Keir Starmer or any other Western European leaders there was particularly material to either the summit or its outcome. But in taking those specific words of Starmer, he's right. He's right that that's the case, because economically this country has suffered as a result of the war in Ukraine. We have provided huge amounts, albeit not enough, but we provided nevertheless huge amounts of military hardware. We provided vast amounts of money and are going to continue to do so. Energy prices have increased as a result of the war and our economic actions. And so, yeah, every family will have been affected. But I don't, I think if you look at the bigger picture, I think it's a mistake to imply that sort of the suffering of British families can be in any way compared to the suffering of Ukrainian families. And I think if anything, he probably should have emphasised that rather than the impact on the UK.
So there has been some talk around this so-called coalition of the willing, particularly with British troops being in Ukraine after this peace agreement. Do you think it's right that British troops would be on the ground in Ukraine if there was some kind of peace deal?
Yeah, I mean, the bigger picture is, I think the security guarantees that were discussed, albeit we don't know the detail of what was discussed or what's expected in Washington for Ukraine. But clearly there was some discussion about whether, if there was some kind of ceasefire or peace agreement, what the security guarantees for Ukraine would be. Clearly the membership of NATO has been excluded. I think not only by Trump, but other members of NATO. So that's not on the table. But what was, I think, discussed to an extent was a NATO Article 5-like agreement between those countries willing to do so and Ukraine, which would essentially, Article 5 is that NATO countries agree to come to the aid of each other if one or more of them is attacked. So effectively a guarantee by maybe the United States, the UK and other countries that they would come to the aid of Ukraine if it was attacked again following a peace agreement. If I was President Zelensky, I'd be very wary of any guarantees like that, because he just has to think back to 1994 when Ukraine voluntarily agreed to disarm itself of nuclear weapons with guarantees from Britain, Russia and the United States that it would not be threatened or attacked. And of course we saw in 2014 when Crimea was seized, and then again in 2022 when the full-scale invasion took place, we saw that that guarantee wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. It achieved really nothing significant, and certainly the countries did not come to the aid of Ukraine. So I would treat that with a degree of skepticism if I was Zelensky, depending on how cast iron the guarantee is going to be. And of course, they can't really be cast iron; they're just basically political promises at the time, which could easily be ducked out of. As far as the possibility of British and other European forces deploying to Ukraine as a part of the so-called coalition of the willing, which would no doubt form part of these security guarantees. I'm very sceptical about this as well. I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that the British forces do not really have the capability to deploy large numbers of troops into Ukraine, and the same goes for other European armies, even if they had the will to do so. I don't think they have the capability. And what's actually being seriously discussed here so far by Britain, maybe it'll change, is not to deploy fighting forces into Ukraine to keep the peace, but to basically carry on what we're doing at the moment, which is to help the Ukrainian army to regenerate. Maybe instead of having Ukrainians come back to Britain to train, have British troops deployed in Ukraine to train them there, which is a much lesser thing, more realistic, I think, but a much lesser thing than actually deploying any form of fighting troops, which was kind of hinted at before. I suspect people have seen reality now in Downing Street. And the second component would be mine-clearing operations in the Black Sea by the Royal Navy, which I think makes perfect sense. It's going on now, mine clearance. It could be expanded and probably needs to be expanded after the war. And the third thing is air policing. And I'm not sure what that means, because I don't believe for a moment it means imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine to prevent Russian air attacks. I don't think that would happen for a minute, because I don't think any Western European country would be willing to send their air forces up against Russia any more than they have so far in this war. It's been discussed previously at the early part of the war, no-fly zones were considered and rejected, and I don't think that would apply. So I don't really understand what, unless air policing means aerial surveillance or something of that sort. So I think there's a lot of big talk been going on. We'll have to see what comes out of the post-Washington summit about security guarantees. But I'm pretty... I feel very... I don't feel very optimistic that any Western country is going to provide the real hard, verifiable security guarantees that Ukraine could possibly need that would deter Russia from further attacks, which is what it's really all about.